Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in today. This is Kathy Aranzana, and today I'm going to show you 5 cards that I created using the August 2018 My Monthly Hero kit. It's a kit with a bunch of coffee stamps, which I think are super adorable. And on this first card, I'm actually using the standalone die that came with the kit. And I wanted to create a background using Distress Oxide Inks. I started with a blueprint sketch. Now I am up to the tumbled glass, which I think is one of my very favorite colors. In the center, I move on and I use Salty Ocean just to get a nice blue blend. The blueprint sketch actually looks a little bit brighter than it is in real life. And I was applying the ink pretty heavy. And then to soften up those lines, I just went back in with the tumbled glass to blend out that line there. And then I do the same thing with the Salty Ocean at the bottom between the blueprint sketch and the Salty Ocean. The next thing that I did was I cut out the die, and I use a Gemini Junior because it cuts beautifully. And I decided to mount that just on a piece of white cardstock. I am using Tombow Mono liquid glue, and then you'll see I switched to a Zig ballpoint glue pen just to get those itty bitty teeny tiny really super thin lines there, which seemed to work well because I am not good with liquid glue. I tend to get it everywhere. So I just mounted that flat onto the white cardstock, and now I'm going to stamp my image. And for the image I used Memento Rich Cocoa ink, and I'm trying to decide what to put on that little sign, and the little rhinestones just weren't working for me, so I set that aside, thought about it later. And here I'm using an obscene amount of foam tape to put on the back of that panel, and that'll be mounted onto the white card base. And at the end here, you'll see the finished sample, and I added a little white coffee cup to that sign, which I actually cut apart from another die that I had cut from just plain white cardstock. Moving on to the next card, I'm doing some Copic coloring. On this coffee cup, I am starting with BG09, and I just want to do the edges just to get a little bit of darkness there, a little bit of shading and shadow. I am obviously a paper turner, so bear with me, it turns a lot during this section here. And I'm doing the edges there really lightly. I tend to be heavy-handed with my darker colors, so I figure if I do a little bit, I can always go back and add more in. I'm moving into my mid-tone, which is BG05, and I'm flicking out further this time, but I am also starting all the way back where I laid down that darker color. I am leaving a pretty generous white space in the center, being that I'm trying to give the coffee mug some shape. When it comes to Copics, I love to color with them, but I am not an expert at all, and I don't know if there really are rules, but I kind of use them so they work for me. Still doing the BG05 there for the handle. And now moving on to BG02, and I'm going to go all the way out from the outer edge all the way into the center, leaving, I wanted my light color to be in that center where I left the white highlight, just to kind of help give that coffee mug some shape. So I go all the way in. I do go over it a couple of times to get the ink to blend out. And same thing on that very back rim, which it's kind of hard to see because it's so little. But I did do the same thing. I worked darkest to lightest into the center just to leave a little bit of a highlight. And here I'm thinking, do I really want to do this? Go just straight up and down over the whole thing? And I'm glad that I did, because it really helped blend some of those colors, and I think that it gave a really nice highlight right there in the center. And then I kind of clean up the top and the bottom, and then I go over it again because I want more blending, and then I realize that I just blended out all of my darkest color, which is another thing that I tend to be guilty of quite often. So I go back in a little bit later and add more dark, just to, no, still on the BGO2, on the handle. Here we go. Oh my goodness. This video, you guys, took forever for me to put together. I really wanted to have it up about, last week, but my computer suddenly decided to start throwing an attitude at me, so it took a little bit longer than anticipated. But I suppose that happens sometimes. So now I'm coloring in the coffee, and I'm using 3 shades of brown. I'm starting with E27, and then I move on to E25, and the last color is E23. And you'll see I did the same thing there. I just tried to leave a white space in the center for a little bit of a highlight. And that's the coloring done for that. Now I'm deciding what sentiment do I want to put on there. Yes, and I decided to emboss it. So right there I was going over the paper with the anti-static tool. The ink I'm using is Memento Luxe in Wedding Dress. This was the first time that I've used this ink, and I really like it. Memento has properties to be able to stamp really crisp images. So I decided to try it on this stamp, and I'm putting white embossing powder over there on the side, and I'm going to heat set it with my heat tool. And I think I hold it up to the camera so you can see. I mean, the ink was really stamped really nicely, and the embossing powder took to it very nicely as well. And there you go. So that's the card for the cup for the first part. And here I wanted to create a text background in the shape of a circle. So I had that patterned paper in my stash. I created a mask just by cutting a circle out using one of my Spellbinders dies. I arranged a bunch of sentiments on an acrylic block, and I'm using VersaMagic Jumbo Java ink. And here I'm just going to kind of randomly stamp it so that there's just this circle of words, and they all kind of have to do with but first coffee. So like there's life begins after coffee, coffee is always a good idea, Java junkie, and I did do but first coffee as well. So I'm just positioning it just to fill in that circle. By putting that mask down, it keeps the images from stamping where I don't want them. So I remove the mask, and there I have a circle with a bunch of text, and I look at it and think I've got a couple of spaces that could be filled. So I used one of the tiny little, I guess it's I'm not sure if it's a foam design or if it's just like a sparkle thing. So I just added that twice in 2 spots, just to fill it up. And here I am in super fast speed mode putting the card together. I did that panel onto a brown piece of cardstock, and then did a little bit of border of like a wood grain type of cardstock, and I didn't quite get it all the way to the edge, so I just colored that in with a brown marker. I adhered that onto a white top folding card base, added some ribbon, and that ribbon, by the way, did also come with the kit, and I ran it through my Xyron to make it sticky. A little bit of foam tape on my mug, and voila, there is the card. And I did use the corresponding die for that coffee cup as well. Moving on to the next card, I wanted to create another text background, and I only used 1 stamp for this one. I was going for like a coffee stain look on that little panel. Again, I'm using the Memento Luxe ink to just kind of randomly stamp it all over that panel, and then I'm going to cover it with white embossing powder and heat set it. It's hard to see in the video, but it really is all there. And I'm using Gathered Twigs Distress ink, and just kind of throwing the ink down on that panel. to go for that resist look so that the words kind of just magically appear when the ink is applied to it. And I'm dabbing, and then to get the ink to move, I just kind of turn the paper. I stamped and embossed the coffee cups that are up from above. It's like you're looking down into the cup. I did stamp them on Canson watercolor paper in Onyx Black VersaFine with clear embossing powder. Watercoloring in the coffee, I used the same Gathered Twigs Distress ink. And one thing with watercoloring is I'm never really very patient with it. Waiting for it to dry. But I'm kind of proud of myself. I was patient this time. For the saucer, I used Tumbled Glass Distress Oxide Ink. Same thing, I just kind of added it to my craft mat and sprayed a little bit of water on it. For the mug itself, I switched over and used Broken China. I wanted the mug part to be darker than the saucer. And rather than just try to keep layering the tumbled glass, I thought I would just go with a darker shade, and that worked out quite well for me. So this watercoloring, obviously because you have to wait for it to dry, always seems to take a little bit longer. And for me, it felt like I was watercoloring for days, but it was kind of nice to break out of my little box that I usually do. Oh, there's my impatience right there, using the heat tool to dry it. It was nice to kind of break out of the box and do something different, because I do tend to use Copics quite a bit on my cards and stuff like that. Once I am happy with the coffee mugs and they've dried completely, which you do want to make sure that they dry completely before you do move on to the next step, I stamped one of the foamy designs, again using the Memento Luxe wedding dress, added some anti-static powder to it, and the kit came with white puff embossing powder, so it puffs up a lot, and it was really kind of cool to use that, because it really did add a lot of dimension to the foam in the center of those little latte mugs. And I'm heat setting it, and I did heat it from the back just a little bit, just to kind of make sure that it really was set. And I'm putting it together. I used the tea dye patterned paper that came with the kit and adhering that to a brown panel, and the brown panel then goes onto a tan colored card. The text background just onto a brown rectangle, and the first latte cup, I did that one flat with glue, and then I added a tiny little spoon that I used my Cricut to cut that out. Add a little bit of foam tape there, just to give that one a little bit of dimension. More foam tape on the back of that, and then I slap that on the front of the card, and there's that third card. Okay, so this card I did some reverse masking, and I used 2 of the coffee cups, but I'm only showing how I did the reverse masking, stamping, and coloring on the smaller of the 2. So I cut out the center of the cup out of a sticky note and applied that to my cardstock. And I'm stamping a sunflower, and that stamp set is from Power Poppy, and I can't remember the name of it, but I'll link it below, and it'll also be linked on my blog as well. And I'm just doing some quick Copic coloring here. I was trying to get some dimension, but those spaces were so tiny that I didn't try too hard. That color right there is YR18, and that is YR14. And then I just go back and add a little bit more dark closer to the center of the flower. And then also I did a little bit of shading back for the the petals of the sunflower that are sitting behind those that are in the front. Oh, I was trying to, here I'm looking at the stamp to see what that little branch thing off is to the side there. Those are actually Chinese lanterns are part of the stamp, but obviously because of the mask they didn't really show up very well, and I thought I could do them in, you know, greens and browns, but you'll see later on I changed my mind and decided, they're going to be sunflowers too. I did the cups in blues. I did, I think that's B23, and then the darkest blue was B18, and then the middle color I did do B24. And I did start with the lightest color just to kind of map out where I needed to go with that one, and then I just keep adding more blue and blending it out, adding the darker, you know, where there would be some shadows, and add a little bit of shape to it. And here I go back in and said, they're sunflowers. So I just went over the colors that I had put down, and I just went over them with the oranges. And I did the same colors for the coffee, E23, 25, and 27, but on this cup I did more E23 just to make it look like it had more cream in it than coffee. And I'm adhering patterned paper to a blue panel, then the white circle onto a scalloped blue, and arranging my mugs. Do I like that? Yes, I do. So I decided I just glue all of that down. And I did do a change on this card as well. After I looked at it, I didn't really like the position of the taller mug, so I ended up taking that off, and you'll see it when it scrolls by. I actually ended up lowering the taller cup so it looked more realistic, having the shorter cup sitting behind it. And on that taller cup I did the same reverse masking thing to get those sunflowers on there, and it was the same set from Power Poppy. And then to ground them I added C5, C3, and C1, and you'll see that I redid the grounding as well, took it all the way to the bottom of the circle just so it was a little bit more finished looking. And here is the final card, and it was quite possibly the easiest card that I did. I took the to-go cup and stamped it on 2 different pieces of patterned cardstock that I had in my stash. And then I stamped the to-go lid onto a piece of white cardstock. Initially I had colored those lids, but when I was putting the card together I didn't like the shading, so I ended up restamping them and just using white lids. For this I did not use the coordinating dies. I wanted to fussy cut them so that there wouldn't be the white border around it, because there wouldn't be a white border, it would have been patterned. And here I am putting it together. Little gingerbread paper on a piece of red, and then that onto a white top folding card base. A little white rectangle onto a red rectangle, and then a little circle that I used to die, and it reads a cup of joy. And I'm spacing my little fishtail banner there, which that reads sending you. And in the set, it's a longer stamp, and I just performed a little bit of stamp surgery and cut it apart just so I could have the sending you, because I wanted the card to read sending you a cup of joy. And there is the final card. Everything will be linked below as well as on my blog. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.